Close your eyes and imagine standing in the center of Rome. Today, if you stand near the Roman Forum, your senses are overwhelmed. You hear the relentless roar of traffic pouring down the Via dei Fori Imperiali. You hear the chatter of thousands of tourists holding cameras, the sharp whistles of traffic police, the hum of Vespa engines, and the distant sirens of a modern European capital of nearly 3 million people. The city is paved, illuminated, and vibrating with relentless energy. But strip all of that away. Silence the engines. Remove the asphalt. Take away the tourists, the electric streetlights, and the cafes. You are standing in the exact same spot, but the year is 800 AD. The first thing you notice is the profound, unsettling quiet. The roar of 1 million ancient citizens is gone, replaced by the sound of wind rustling through dense foliage, the bleating of goats, and the distant, rhythmic tolling of a bronze church bell. You are standing in a forest of marble. To your left, the massive arches of the Basilica of Maxentius loom like the ribbed skeleton of a colossal, extinct beast, half swallowed by ivy and creeping vines. Beneath your feet, the grand paving stones of the Via Sacra, the sacred road where triumphant emperors once paraded, are buried under a thick layer of compacted mud, manure, and overgrown grass. In the distance, the Colosseum still stands, but it is not a preserved monument. It is a shadowy, decaying mountain of stone. You can see thin plumes of wood smoke rising from its lower arches. People are living inside it. Between the ancient temples, the small patches of earth have been tilled for cabbage and leeks. You are standing inside a city built to house and entertain 1 million people, but there are only about 30,000 souls left. This is the reality of Rome in the early Middle Ages. It is a city wearing the oversized garments of a dead giant, struggling to keep warm in its folds. To understand how ordinary people lived in this haunting, beautiful, and broken landscape, we must understand the specific moment in history they inhabited. The year 800 AD is a turning point for Western civilization. For centuries, the Roman Empire in the West had been a memory. Rome had been sacked by Visigoths, plundered by Vandals, and devastated by a brutal decades-long war in the 6th century between the Byzantine Empire and the Ostrogoths. By the year 800, his secular power had shifted entirely. The city was under the control of the papacy. The Pope was not just a spiritual leader. He was the political ruler, the mayor, the chief administrator, and the primary defender of the city. He relied on a fragile alliance with the Franks, a powerful Germanic people from the north. In fact, on Christmas Day in the year 800, within the walls of the old St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Leo III would place a crown on the head of the Frankish king Charlemagne, declaring him the new emperor of the Romans. But this grand political theater masked a harsh, localized reality. Charlemagne's empire was vast, but his true power lay in northern Europe. For the inhabitants of Rome, imperial titles meant very little compared to the daily struggle for survival. The sheer scale of the demographic collapse in Rome is difficult for the modern mind to grasp. Imagine a city the size of modern-day Austin, Texas, or San Francisco, suddenly losing 97% of its population, but leaving all the skyscrapers, stadiums, and highways perfectly intact. Because of this, 8th and 9th century Rome was divided into 2 distinct worlds, the abitato and the disabitato. The disabitato, the uninhabited zone, made up roughly 2/3 of the area enclosed by the massive 12-mile-long Aurelian walls. In the days of the emperors, these areas, the high hills like the Palatine, the Aventine, and the Caelian, were the most exclusive real estate on earth, covered in sprawling imperial palaces, grand villas, and towering bath complexes. But by 800 AD, the hills were silent. They had been abandoned, and nature had violently reclaimed them. If you walked up the Palatine Hill, you would not find aristocrats. You would find dense woodlands, overgrown gardens, and wolves. Packs of wolves frequently breached the crumbling sections of the city walls, roaming the ruined imperial estates at night. The reason for this abandonment was simple and brutal. The aqueducts were dead. During the siege of Rome in 537 AD, the invading Gothic armies had deliberately severed the massive stone aqueducts that brought millions of gallons of fresh spring water into the city from the distant mountains. Without the pressure of the aqueducts, water could no longer reach the high hills. The monumental fountains ran dry. The massive public baths, which required vast amounts of water and slave labor to heat, became useless mountains of brick. Faced with death by dehydration, the remaining population did the only thing they could. They packed up their belongings, abandoned the hills, and migrated down into the low-lying floodplain of the Tiber River, specifically into the area known as the Campus Martius. This is the problem, change, and consequence loop that defined medieval Rome. The destruction of infrastructure forced a topographical revolution. In the Campus Martius, daily life was a paradox. You lived surrounded by the architectural achievements of gods, but you lived the life of a peasant. The grand grid of Roman streets had long since broken down. Without a central authority to maintain the ancient sewers like the Cloaca Maxima, they frequently clogged. The Tiber River, untamed by the high modern embankments we see today, flooded with terrifying regularity. When the river swelled with winter rains, the dark, muddy waters would pour into the streets, filling the ground floors of homes, bringing with it raw sewage, dead animals, and debris. When the waters receded, they left behind a thick layer of foul-smelling silt. Over the centuries, this constant flooding, combined with the accumulation of ordinary human garbage and the rubble of collapsing buildings, literally raised the ground level of the city. By 800 AD, the citizens of Rome were walking on a surface that was anywhere from 10 to 20 feet higher than the ancient imperial pavements. Housing in this era was intensely practical and wildly diverse. Very few people built entirely new structures from scratch. Why quarry new stone when you live in the greatest stone quarry on earth? If you were an ordinary tradesman, a baker, or a fisherman, your home might be a modest, one-story structure made of salvaged brick and timber. It would have a heavy wooden door, small windows with wooden shutters to keep out the winter cold. Glass was an unimaginable luxury for the poor, and a roof of scavenged terracotta tiles. But where you built this house was the fascinating part. Romans became masters of architectural parasitism. Families would build their timber homes nestled tightly between the massive columns of ancient pagan temples. The Theater of Marcellus, an enormous ancient entertainment complex, had its great open archways bricked up and converted into dozens of individual apartments and defensive strongholds. Even the Colosseum was completely repurposed. Its bloody days of gladiatorial combat were centuries in the past. By 800 AD, it was essentially a fortified village. Local families walled up the lower arches to create homes, workshops, and stables for their livestock. The arena floor, where men and animals once died for entertainment, was filled with a thick layer of dirt and used as a communal garden. The daily diet for these medieval Romans was entirely different from their imperial ancestors. In the ancient world, a fleet of massive grain ships arrived from Egypt and North Africa to feed the Roman populace. The emperor provided a daily grain dole to keep the masses pacified. In 800 AD, there was no grain dole. The global supply chains of the ancient world had shattered. Rome was forced to feed itself on a hyper-local level. Bread remained the staple of the diet, made from wheat or cheaper grains like barley, grown in the fields directly outside the city walls or even in the empty disabitato zones inside the walls. Because the aqueducts were broken, there was no running water to power the great hillside grain mills. Instead, medieval Romans engineered floating water mills. They built heavy wooden wheels mounted on boats, anchored directly in the fast-flowing currents of the Tiber River. These floating mills constantly ground the grain that kept the city alive. Alongside coarse bread, people ate whatever they could grow or catch. The Tiber provided fish, though the water quality was questionable. Gardens inside the city yielded onions, garlic, cabbages, and legumes. Meat was a rarity for the poor, mostly limited to pork, as pigs could easily be kept in the city, feeding on garbage and foraging in the ruins. Wealthier citizens and high-ranking clergy might enjoy imported cheeses, olive oil from the surrounding countryside, and wine. The wine of the medieval era was often sour and heavily diluted with water. Working life was localized. There were blacksmiths forging tools, potters making basic ceramics, and a bustling river trade. But one of the most significant, and, to a modern mind, tragic, industries of early medieval Rome was the lime-burning trade. The people who lived in 800 AD needed mortar to build their churches, repair their walls, and maintain their homes. To make mortar, you need quicklime. And to get quicklime, you need to burn marble. For hundreds of years, the calcarari, the lime burners, operated giant, smoldering kilns scattered across the city. Their fuel was the classical Roman Empire. Countless exquisite, priceless marble statues of emperors, gods, and athletes, along with beautifully carved inscriptions and the marble facing of temples, were hauled into these kilns. They were smashed to pieces with iron hammers and burned at incredibly high temperatures for days until they dissolved into white powder. They were not doing this out of spite or vandalism. They were not trying to erase the past. They were simply surviving. The ancient statues held no emotional or historical value to them. They were simply raw, available materials in a harsh world. When you are cold, hungry, and need to patch the roof of your church before the winter rains, a statue of Apollo is nothing more than a convenient source of building material. This points to a massive psychological shift. The people of Rome in 800 AD did not view themselves as the guardians of an ancient pagan empire. They viewed themselves as the center of the Christian world. The physical landscape reflected this absolute shift in worldview. The ancient temples of the classical era were either ignored, dismantled, or occasionally Christianized. And compare the fate of two magnificent ancient buildings, the Baths of Diocletian and the Pantheon. The Baths of Diocletian were a sprawling, mountainous complex of brick and marble, but because they were deeply associated with pagan excess and required defunct aqueducts to function, they were abandoned. Citizens stripped the marble from the walls. They gouged deep holes into the brickwork to extract the valuable iron and lead clamps holding the stones together, leaving the ruins looking like they had been scarred by a terrible disease. The Pantheon, however, survived perfectly intact. Why? Because in the 7th century, the Byzantine emperor gifted the building to the Pope, who consecrated it as a Christian church, Santa Maria ad Martyris, by placing an altar inside and moving cartloads of martyrs' bones from the catacombs into its crypt. The building was made holy. Once it was a church, it was a sin to steal its lead roof or burn its marble. Religion was the only effective preservation tool in the Middle Ages. Religion also drove the new economy. Rome was no longer a military or commercial superpower. Its primary export was salvation. By the year 800, pilgrimage was the lifeblood of the city. Devout Christians from as far away as England, Francia, and the German states undertook incredibly dangerous, months-long journeys over the Alps to reach Rome. They came to pray at the tombs of the apostles Peter and Paul, and to acquire holy relics. These pilgrims arrived in a city that must have terrified and awed them. Northern Europeans, accustomed to living in settlements made of wood and thatch, had walked through the gates of Rome and saw decaying structures of stone and brick that were so massive they defied human comprehension. Many medieval pilgrims genuinely believed that the ruined baths and colosseums were built by demons or a forgotten race of giants, as they could not fathom ordinary men moving such colossal stones. To cater to these foreigners, distinct neighborhoods called scolae sprang up around the old St. Peter's Basilica, which at the time sat outside the city walls across the river. There was a scola for the Saxons, one for the Franks, one for the Frisians, and one for the Lombards. These were effectively medieval tourist zones, complete with hostels, taverns, hospitals, and money changers. The modern Vatican area originated as this bustling, multilingual settlement of foreign pilgrims gathered around the Apostles' tomb. But living in or visiting Rome was incredibly dangerous. The danger did not just come from the sharp blades of bandits who hid in the dark, overgrown ruins of the Palatine Hill. The greatest killer in medieval Rome was invisible. It came from the swamps. As the ancient drainage systems failed, low-lying areas, particularly around the Roman Forum and the Tiber Bend, became stagnant marshlands. These marshes became perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes. Malaria, known historically as Roman fever, became an absolute scourge. Summer and early autumn were the seasons of death. The air would grow thick and humid, and fevers would sweep through the dense, crowded neighborhoods of the Campus Martius. Popes, kings, and commoners all fell victim to the fever. The wealthy would flee to the higher, cleaner air of the hills outside the city, but the poor were trapped in the humid, stagnant lowlands. Malaria shaped the demographics of Rome for over 1,000 years, keeping the population artificially low and preventing the city from fully recovering its strength. Yet, despite the flooding, the plagues, the poverty, and the crumbling infrastructure, the city did not die. It simply adapted. When we look at modern Rome today, we are looking at the final result of the transformations that occurred around the year 800. If you walk down the Via del Corso today, a straight, bustling shopping street in the heart of Rome, you are walking on the ancient Via Flaminia. In 800 AD, it was a muddy, unpaved track winding past abandoned monuments, dangerous to walk at night without a heavy club and a torch. The magnificent Piazza Navona, famous today for its Baroque fountains and open-air cafes, perfectly preserves its long oval shape because it is built directly on top of the ruined grandstands of the ancient Stadium of Domitian. In the Middle Ages, people simply built their houses onto the curved tiers of the stadium, and the open running track in the center became the public square. Modern Rome is a city of layers, and the medieval layer is the vital connective tissue that bridges the gap between the emperors and the modern era. The popes of the Middle Ages navigated an apocalyptic landscape, taking the broken stones of an empire and using them to construct the foundations of the Western Church. The story of Rome in 800 AD teaches us a profound lesson about human civilization. It shows us that cities are incredibly, almost stubbornly, resilient. A city can lose its empire, lose its wealth, lose its water, and lose 97% of its people. Its grandest monuments can be reduced to livestock pens and lime kilns. But as long as a river flows, and as long as humans are willing to adapt, scavenge, and rebuild from the ruins, a city does not truly die. It just waits in the mud and the silence, building a new world on top of the old, stone by stolen stone.